Sefer Bamidbar, Parshat Balak, on outside viewpoints. This week's Torah portion is a unique episode for many reasons, but especially for the fact that we have stepped outside of the normal viewpoint. Instead of sitting in the camp with Moshe and all the people, seeing their struggles and successes up close, we instead view the people through the eyes of Bilam, a prophet of the Moabites. In fact, the change of perspective is so strange that the sages of the Babylonian Talmud treat the story of Bilam as an entity distinct from the Torah when they are discussing which books of Tanakh have Mosaic authorship. In the Parsha, King Balak summons Bilam and hires him to curse the people of Israel, a task that quickly proves to be full of challenges. Famously, his donkey sees an angel blocking the way and speaks to Bilam in understandable human language. After 3 attempts at cursing the people, each time blessings coming forth from his mouth, instead, Bilam continues to prophesy about the fate of the Moabites and the destiny of Am Yisrael. After all of this, we have what might seem like an unrelated happening. The famous scene in which Israelite men are seduced to idol worship by Moabite women, resulting in the incident where Pinchas murders one couple, ostensibly while they are in the act. This Torah portion is without a doubt trying to say something to us about interfaith or intercultural relations. The Moabites are a people who are explicitly forbidden from intermarrying with, and yet they have a prophet who throughout the entire drama pledges unnuanced loyalty to relaying only the words of the one true God, using the same holy names and descriptors that are used by Am Yisrael throughout the Torah and to this day. What's the meaning in this contrast? Can we really accept prophecy from someone who lives among people, who is in some ways bound to a people, whose values and understanding of divinity are in severe conflict with our own? All of this is made more complicated by the reality that Judaism doesn't have a consensus on what exactly a prophet is, while simultaneously having a belief brought down in the Talmud that some aspect of prophecy, Ruach HaKodesh, or divine spirit, left Am Yisrael when the final prophets of the Tanakh died. Let's examine the idea of a Gentile prophet with a vague definition. The prophet is someone who has a special connection with the divine that can be verbalized to others, whose words are intended to comment on the status quo, possibly pointing out the consequences or urging behavioral change. At first glance, the notion of a Gentile prophet might seem ridiculous, or at least improbable, as a people who believe we received a distinct, particular revelation. We would be good candidates for becoming a tradition that only gives credence to the prophecy of our own kind. After all, we were singled out as a people almost to be a sort of nation of prophets, following these loose guidelines for what a prophet might be. But it is written clearly and directly into our most sacred text that Bilam was, in fact, a prophet of Hashem, and later generations went so far as to assert that not only was he a prophet like Moses, but perhaps even better. The Sifrei compares Bilam to someone who works in the home of a king, someone who knows not just what the king serves for dinner, but is intimately familiar with how much it costs. It likely helps a good deal that Bilam was saying nice things about us, but he wasn't the only Gentile prophet that the rabbinic tradition sees and holds respect for, according to the Babylonian Talmud. He is one of at least 7, with the others being his father, as well as 5 characters from Sefer Iyov, the book of Job, Elihu, the 3 friends, and Job himself. Moreover, while there might be relatively few Gentile prophets evidenced in text describing the world of Moses and beforehand, there are certainly Gentiles who we are guided towards thinking quite well of. One obvious example is Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who debatably converted to Judaism, but was definitely a Midianite priest when we met him. Perhaps less obvious is someone like Rahab from the book of Joshua, who not only was the anchor of the sole family saved from Jericho's obliteration, but who inspired a long-standing tradition in rabbinic literature. She was a prostitute, but when she joined the Jewish people, she merited to marry Joshua himself and become the alleged foremother of 8 or more prophets, including none other than the prophet Jeremiah and the prophetess Huldah. And of course, Ruth the Moabitess converts and becomes the grandmother of King David. There seems to be a bit of a trend. But beyond the scope of our codified literature, certainly in modern times, our idea of what qualifies someone as a righteous Gentile certainly does not have to include conversion, As no small example, there's over 28,000 individuals recognized by Yad Vashem with the title of the righteous among the nations for the work they did to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. They have all been extended the offer of citizenship in the state of Israel, contemporary equivalents of what the Torah refers to as a ger toshav, and over 100 of them have moved to Israel to live among the Jewish people. These are cases where the good a Gentile has done or the love she has for the Jewish people is inarguably present. But what about prophets who perhaps aren't entirely concerned with us? Is there a possibility that prophecy that doesn't support our own ideas about our peoplehood has validity, or at least a valence thereof? How do we handle contradictions in prophecy if we embrace a sort of pluralistic potential to prophecy? Why be Jewish if other prophets exist and have their own truth to tell? These are questions that are not just challenging, but potentially dangerous to any religious or cultural project, and they might open the doors to supersessionist theology. In contemporary times, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, of blessed memory, wrote a sentence in his book, The Dignity of Difference, How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations, that actually got him, the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, accused of heresy. He wrote, "No one creed has a monopoly on spiritual truth." Because of the heresy accusations coming primarily from the Haredi world, this was revised and additional ink was spilled clarifying how this was misinterpreted and spelling out the reality that yes, Judaism does acknowledge the existence of other covenants, look to the Torah, and recognize that when Noach lands in the new world, every living creature on the face of the planet becomes party to that covenant with the divine, the promise that the world will never again be destroyed by flood. We see time and again that God promises to make great nations out of Ishmael and Esau, rewarding people and peoples beyond our own. But we don't see in this level of text all of their destinies. If biblical structure is good at one thing, it forces us to mind our own business by focusing on the stories that matter most to our mission in this world. We don't know what other nations' Torah says, but we do know that it can, according to our own, exist and be true. But how can we know if what other people claim as divine revelation is actually fully or even partially true? Because, as Rabbi Sacks clarified, not everything outside of the unique heritage of the Jewish people is true, even though parts of it certainly are. Much earlier, Maimonides famously argued that Islam and Christianity helped to pave the path toward the Messianic era. Rabbi Yaakov Emden went even further with how Islam and Christianity were necessary for settling the world and achieving a higher collective welfare. Because, Pirkei Avot teaches, every assembly which is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure. Rabbi Dr. Yitz Greenberg, my teacher, goes much further and perhaps is not afraid of accusations of heresy. His books include titles such as Judaism and Christianity, their respective roles in the divine strategy of redemption, covenantal pluralism, and for the sake of heaven and earth, the new encounter between Judaism and Christianity, in which he argues that both faiths are necessary partners in perfecting one another towards achieving the task of fulfilling the divine's will. Quote, one of Greenberg's most provocative comments is that Jesus was not a false Messiah, but a failed Messiah. It's easy to imagine a lot of Jews and a lot of Christians not appreciating a statement like that, even beyond the Haredi world. And it's surely on the more radical end of how to view prophecy beyond the covenant. While Jesus was a Jew, his prophecy was global, and he is, by and large, thought of as a heretic in traditional Jewish circles. Finding and holding a view that Jews can and perhaps should acknowledge some sort of validity to Jesus, whose followers have spent much of the past 2 millennia attempting to convert us by sword, economic punishment, and other techniques, moves beyond interreligious tolerance into actual pluralism. To the extent that Christian doctrine builds itself upon the back of Jewish heritage, we are often encouraged to read Jesus and his followers as illiterate or just plain crazy. How much would it change our understanding of our own faith to understand Jesus differently? While Catholics are officially prohibited from attempting to convert Jews following Vatican II, others Christians are not and are still active in this pursuit. Can we, as small of a people as we are, really afford to give Christianity an inch as it continues its attempts to extract Daled Amot, the tiny space we occupy? If we don't feel comfortable approaching such significant shifts, we should at least be mindful of the long tradition Judaism has of thinking about other faiths. The Meiri famously asserted that ethical monotheists have the status of the ger toshav, the resident alien, which is to say that they are not idol worshippers and should have a special heightened status in the eyes of Jewish people, as opposed to a random unknown person. While this position is not representative of the bulk of pre-modern Jewish literature, it is the position that most contemporary Jews seem to take, whether as an educated position or by default. We want to help other good people, whether they keep Shabbat or not, and we tend to trust them to be decent neighbors, even if we don't trust their understanding of something like the laws of shatnez. By extension, people who espouse belief in one God, but do not act as if they believe that said deity created all of us in likeness of the divine, can be considered idolaters. What the Meiri asserted in the 13th century became a major pillar in modern schools of thought, by which we might at times consider ourselves idolaters, when we are taken over by anger, when we think that our personal will is more significant than the well-being of others, or any of the other versions of immorality that compose more abstract concepts of idolatry. And while we do have separate faiths, separate laws, as a separate people in the world, the Torah does spend plenty of time displaying realities of shared humanity. While other people's religious or even social ways might not be appropriate for Jews, perhaps we can recognize and connect with a fundamentally human urge to connect with the divine, to have some sort of spiritual transcendence, to display gratitude towards something higher than our worldly systems. For many contemporary people, we have to assume that they are trying to relate to the same God that we are. Even in cases like the Christian idea of the Trinity, or even Hindu concepts of one God being accessible in various forms, not entirely unlike the plurality of divine names found in Judaism or Kabbalistic concepts that speak to some sort of fragmentation within human experiences of Hashem, there is a notion that the rabbinic tradition refers to as shituf, or association, where while those modes of worship aren't distinctly monotheistic enough for traditional Jews, they aren't problematic in the same way as something like worship of Athena or another member of the Greek pantheon would be. Ultimately, the question of whether or not people of different faiths claim to be prophets are legitimate, or how we should regard them, are in the category of things that will likely only be sorted out with additional divine revelation. The question for us is how to consider spiritual and religious knowledge from other traditions and their followers. Ben Zoma famously said that the person who is truly wise is the one who learns from all people, Pirkei Avot 4:1. This certainly must include the hypermajority of the human population, both those living and those who have passed. While we have a religious principle of adopting that which is beneficial, so long as it does not contradict with leading a Jewish lifestyle, which has granted us access to all sorts of technologies as they have been developed, we also know that God values human diversity. Every single one of us was made B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God, and yet so incredibly different. And reading what it was that Bilam said to bless us points us in the direction of mutual appreciation, rather than syncretism, appropriation, or assimilation. From his view on the mountaintop, he sees something in us that we don't necessarily see in ourselves. He praises our tents, which has traditionally been read as a comment on our modesty or privacy. We are a people, many families, many tribes, who coexist as one tribe, who stand in unity without peeking into one another's homes. Each household has its own ways for carrying Torah forth. Some are tasked with physically carrying the Torah, while others fund the creation of Torah, and others focus on study. This is still true of Jews today. And maybe, just maybe, this can be an example for how we work together with people and peoples, and maybe even donkeys, who have different Torah in this world. When we are listening to the words of others, the rubric is really whether or not it's something compatible with the ethical monotheism Judaism deems appropriate for public and semi-public spheres, rather than whether or not it's something we should bring home. Those matters are taken piecemeal. Plenty of rabbis still love to get into the weeds about them. But one thing we should take home is the light that others see in us as a reminder to keep shining in our own unique way. Shabbat Shalom.